make sure you're using the hashtag SN22Live when you're posting on Twitter and Instagram, and that way we can pick it up and share it as well. That would be really good. So it's a real pleasure to bring on our next speaker, Ed Olsworth-Peter. I'm going to bring him in. And as I do that, I'm going to share his bio. Ed is Director of Innovation and Development for St Mellitus College. He is a creative, a coach, and he's interested in the relationship between faith and culture. He loves to think outside the box and to pioneer new things. I first met Ed a few years ago when our diocese put on a pioneer conference in Hampshire, and he shared some great stuff at that conference. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what you got to share this afternoon for us, Ed.
Yeah, great. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Good to be with you. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about what does the Bible say about entrepreneurship for the next 20 minutes or so. A really good title. I've really enjoyed thinking about it, actually, and trying to work out what that might mean. I guess my start point is, I'm sure that we're exploring all the way through this stream, what is an entrepreneur? People might define that in different ways. I guess we might think of Alan Sugar and his apprentice that's back on BBC One with the usual kind of antics of running around with suitcases and trying to find 12 things in an hour or in 24 hours or whatever goes on. And that is obviously part of entrepreneurialism. But there's something also interesting about not-for-profit, about people who are doing that in a subsistence way. They're not wanting to make money, they're not necessarily starting businesses or charities. They're actually doing it either to sustain themselves or to sustain their local community. And we can see both of those things in the Bible. And I've been having a bit of a read around. I just wanted to share one slide with you as we start. So this is a picture from about 20 years ago, around university time. 3 times I went out to South America with Latin Link, which was a mission organization, mission agency, and to Bolivia. This is us. You can see me sort of here trying to build a wall very badly with some of our team. But we met some amazing people who would not describe themselves as entrepreneurs or business people. They were wanting to make their own lives better. They were wanting to make their communities a better place, but through amazing ingenuity, imagination, absolute sort of resilience and gut determination in a lot of abject poverty. Particularly if you look at the picture there of the woman selling blankets, a lot of women working to kind of find ways they could make some money, they can provide for their families. A lot of men, it sounds a bit sexist, but a lot of the men were involved in the building. It's just how it was out there at that time. But all kinds of crazy techniques in terms of what they needed to do. So when we're thinking about entrepreneurialism, it's not just about a sort of commercialism. I think there's this subsistence level of being an entrepreneur. And maybe as we go through this next few minutes, you might want to think about this in both senses of what that might mean. So we're going to think about, like, linguistically a little bit about what does the word entrepreneur mean and how could that help us? Think a little bit about some entrepreneurs in the Bible, but also about some qualities and practices that we might see in scripture that could be really helpful for us as emerging entrepreneurs or growing and established entrepreneurs. So what always strikes me is the difference between somebody who has an idea about something, who's a dreamer, someone who starts something new, and someone who sees it through to fruition and creates something that is sustainable and realizes its full potential. So in that sense, I don't think everybody who has a good idea is an entrepreneur. Quite a few people have ideas and actually they don't go anywhere. And that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's not their calling, but an entrepreneur has got that ability. And I think it's a gift within us to actually make it happen. And more than that, to make it happen and make it sustainable, to make it into something. As we know, there are many, many things we might do that don't work. And that's where the greatest learning comes from. But there's this persistence that keeps people going as entrepreneurs that's, I think, pretty key. Steve Jobs famously said, I'm convinced that about half of what separates successful entrepreneurs from non-successful ones is pure perseverance. So that kind of grit, drive to really kind of hold on to that vision that they might have had and to actually make it a reality. So I've been thinking a little bit linguistically about the word entrepreneur, which I just want to share with you. If my screen will work here. So the English word entrepreneur really comes from enterprise. So an entrepreneur is somebody who is engaged in an enterprise. But tracking that back, it's really from the Latin word prehendere, which means to take. And from that, we get the French word entreprendre, which means to undertake, to do something, to make something happen. So there's a theme as entrepreneurs that we are, in a way, undertakers. That might seem a slightly strange thing to label entrepreneurs as. You may not want to be involved in the practice of being an undertaker in a funeral company, but in the 18th century in Britain is where we get this sense of undertaker from in the language we have now. They were the people in a funeral director company who would do the business side, who would take on, who'd work out how to advertise, to work out how their business could grow. So actually, dead bodies to one side, there is something about being an undertaker, the person who can make things happen, who can take it to the next level. So entrepreneurialism as something that we take hold of. It's something about action, isn't it? We make things happen as entrepreneurs. And so just biblically, two verses that struck me as I was preparing. The first here from Luke chapter 6. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? And also from James. So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. There's a strong theme throughout the Old and New Testament that actually, as God's people, as followers of Jesus, it's not just about believing he is there, believing he's with us, it's about putting it into action, living a Christian life practically, sharing what we believe. The 5 marks of mission also talk about social action, a call to social action, and also about creation and protecting the world around us. As Christians, we are people of action. And so if part of the root of the word entrepreneur is about to undertake or to action, then we see this as a biblical mandate, just as followers of God, let alone as entrepreneurs. The second theme, though, of this word, prehendere, the Latin word, also can have a sense of to lay hold of, which is slightly different. And if you add the word ad in Latin, you get the word apprehendere, which we get our English word apprehend, to apprehend. And generally we use this word, I guess, when someone has been apprehended, they've been caught doing something wrong or illegal, they're apprehended by the police. And that is part of its meaning, but it has a slightly wider meaning, as in to grasp, to fully grasp and lay hold of, physically, mentally, emotionally, I think also spiritually. And if we think about this through scripture, this idea of grasping, so to really focus, to hang on with all your might. It could be physically, but it's probably going to be mentally and emotionally, I think, as well as entrepreneurs. Passage from Hosea says, in the womb, he grasped his brother's heel. As a man, he struggled with God. And this is, of course, referencing to Genesis, to Jacob, who wrestled with the angel or with the man, the representation of God in some way, which we read about in chapter 32. And as I'm sure you know, Jacob being at the end of his tether at that point in time, the name Jacob meant deceiver, or actually more literally grabber. He'd not been living life well. He was a con artist. He was manipulative, a liar. He's kind of got to the end of everything in his anxiety and frustration, and out of pure frustration, as we know in the account, wrestles the angel and keeps on wrestling until he says, I will not stop until you bless me. And it's kind of an epiphany moment, isn't it, for Jacob, just thinking, okay, this has all got to come to some kind of conclusion. He's confronting his failure, his misdoings, and in that absolute grasping with God, struggled until God blessed him. So what does that mean for us to have that level of grasping and laying hold of God spiritually? Philippians chapter 3 tells us, but I press on that I may lay hold of that for which Christ Jesus has also laid hold of me. And in that sense, it's the same again. It's that actually, as people of God, as Christians, we are laying hold, we are apprehending all that we can of God, not to capture him and imprison him, but to embody him, to live with him and him in us as temples of the Holy Spirit. So I just think in our Christian lives, there's something about undertaking God and what he calls us to do and grasping our absolute focus of absolutely laying hold of God, of Jesus, of the gospel in our lives. But fascinatingly, this is also two roots of the word entrepreneur. So putting it all together, I want to look at a few biblical examples of where people in the Bible have undertook or undertaken and also grasped that might tell us a little bit about what principles there could be for those who are entrepreneurs. I'm going to stop the share screen for a moment there. Solomon came to my mind in the Old Testament, the third king of Israel. He reigned over a united kingdom of the northern and southern kingdoms, and as we know, famously was wise with the judgment of Solomon that we read about of the two women, but also built the temple. His father, King David, I think, had collected materials for the temple building, but it was Solomon who was able to actually make it happen. He also was very good at business. He managed to make the most of two ancient trading routes that brought together to bring a lot of prosperity and wealth to the kingdom at that time. So he built a lot of wealth that wasn't there before, and also didn't really exist after him. But actually, he did it not just to store up loads of wealth, but actually he used it for production rather than protection. He made the cities and nation a better place, resourcing people and place through his entrepreneurialism. So in his undertaking, he's there doing that politically, commercially, but also, I guess, a lot of project management with building the temple, but also in terms of strategically to make the kingdom a stable place. And he's grasping, in that sense, as an entrepreneur, by seeing the need of the nation, seeing the need for its unity, its prosperity, and its function. So I guess that's kind of quite a classic entrepreneurial way of thinking. But I want to suggest five principles that I have to say I collected from a slight Twitter conversation that I had a few weeks ago with a few people who were suggesting characters and qualities of entrepreneurs. So thank you to them for these collected thoughts. I picked out five that were perhaps slightly less obvious. We all know entrepreneurs need to be persevering, taking risks, be creative. But here are a few other things. I'm going to go through each of them with a biblical example, biblical character, thinking about how they are also undertaking action and grasping in focus. And then once I've done that, I'll recap with a slide at the end with the five different principles I'm talking about. So don't worry if you can't catch them all as I'm talking. So the first thing someone said was to have a thick enough skin to fend off the voice of opposition or failure. Pretty key as an entrepreneur. And it reminds me of Lydia, who we read about in Acts chapter 16. He was a dealer of cloth, of purple cloth, in the Roman world. She was, Roman women were allowed to be in business and also to own property at that time. And so I guess there's a level of her entrepreneurialism just in having that business. We know she was widowed. She had a large house, so we don't really know where that prosperity came from, but it could have been partly to do with her business. But more interestingly, I think she's a missional entrepreneur, because we also know that through her home that was large enough to gather people in, it became a centre for a church, but also a centre for Christian activity in the area. She also takes in Paul and Silas when they're released from prison to minister to them. So she's taking a lot of risk in what she's doing. This is quite a dangerous thing that she's doing, but she's undertaking, I guess, a level of a successful business. Her work in allowing church to form and church planting and pioneering in that sense. But her grasping underneath that, her laying hold of, must have been because of laying hold of the person of Jesus to take that risk, but also grasping the importance of the ministry of Paul, and also, I guess, grasping that she could take up her cross and follow Jesus. She was doing quite a big thing here by opening up her home in these different ways, and did that through having a thick skin. So Lydia, our first example. Second, a really classic, I think, Old Testament entrepreneur of Nehemiah, and building this amazing wall that he builds. And so the second theme is having a vision so clear that you cannot but act upon it, and to do that out of love. And I wonder, with social entrepreneurialism, that's particularly important, isn't it? To have a vision that is so established that we can't help but act upon it. And we see this in Nehemiah. His brother comes to visit. Nehemiah's in exile as the king's cupbearer, so the person who would taste the king's food and drink to see if it was poisoned. So close to the king. And his heart kind of breaks for the state and the welfare of the city back home. And through this process of praying, planning, and then pushing forward in a lot of detail, he does praying and planning. He manages to articulate a vision that is compelling enough that the king released him in exile to go back and build the wall. And I guess that's through the relationship the king had and the trust that the king had with Nehemiah. It's thought that it was the third attempt that someone had gone to try and rally a team to build the wall. So it's no mean feat even to get there to do it, but he had the passion for the welfare of the city, I think. Not just, oh, let's build a wall. I mean, some people might get excited about building a wall, but I think there's always a purpose for walls, aren't there? Perhaps good and bad purposes. But to think about what he needed to do, he managed to rally enough people to build a 2.5 mile wall in 52 days. People probably who hadn't built walls before, who weren't necessarily experienced in that. So he must have had an amazing ability as well to vision cast and to mobilize a team to get people to work together to do this. So his love drove his entrepreneurialism. I think he was undertaking by planning well, pushing forward through people management and through vision casting, and grasping and laying hold of that passion for the people, for their welfare, and the impact that this wall would bring to the society he loved and cared about. So that's two. Moving on to our third example. Somebody said on Twitter, well, a good quality of an entrepreneur is knowing your why. Yeah, that is really important, isn't it? It's not just about what you do and how you do it, but why are you doing this? What's the point of it? And actually, maybe unlikely entrepreneurial candidate came to my mind for this, which was actually that of Mary, the mother of Jesus, having just journeyed through the Christmas story recently, as we all have. And if you think about it, of course, she was an amazing person of prayer, faithful to God, incredibly obedient in her response. And I guess her undertaking is that she didn't have a lot of choice in the matter, but she undertook what God was asking her to do, to be the mother of Jesus, to give birth to this child in the face of ridicule, accusation. She undertook an amazing physical journey to Bethlehem. It must have been an emotional, mental, spiritual journey that she was on throughout her whole life, actually, watching her son at the cross on Good Friday. But I guess she grasped what she needs to do that enabled her to do this by knowing that actually this king needed to be born. And in that sense, she grapples with the angel in her conversation, like, is this really true? Is this really for me? And we see her Song of Mary, or the Magnificat, the word she speaks in response to the angel's visit, just showing that grasp of what God was doing, not knowing all the detail, but just saying, yeah, I'm laying hold of this. I understand you're in this, God, somehow. I'm going to do this with you and for you. So maybe Mary, a good example of knowing your why. It was the why, I think, that must have helped her through this, mind-blowing task that she was given. The fourth principle, that of not working alone and entrepreneuring, being an entrepreneur, enterprising as a team. And I think this is really important, and maybe more important as we move out of our pandemic times. We've had to learn to work together, I think, in all sorts of ways, haven't we? In our communities, in our work, in the things that we do in our local communities, in our entrepreneurial pioneer things. Working on your own has some advantages, but I think things are always better with a mix of people who bring different skills, don't they? And for me, thinking about Epiphany, which we're in now, the Magi, the wise men, really spoke to me of working together. We don't really know how many magi were there. We're told wise men came from the east, so there's more than one. But their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh traditionally lead us to think that there were three. But making that journey, I guess it's quite possible there was a whole caravan with them of people supporting them. Who knows? But they must have had to have worked as a team to make this journey, not really quite understanding the meaning. They're looking for a king in a palace. They go to Herod first, if you remember, but knowing enough through what they could see in the stars to guide them to find the Messiah. So in working as a team, I think they helped each other to take this risk. They helped each other in perseverance, particularly meeting Herod and realizing not to go back through that dream, but also making that intellectual and geographical journey together, which I think, they must have needed each other's support for that. But also they managed to do this by grasping, in some sense, the plan of God for this new king. And also through who he was to be, because the gifts are symbolic, aren't they? The gold representing Jesus' kingship, the frankincense representing his priesthood, being the interceder, and myrrh representing his death and resurrection. So a lot of grasping and laying hold of what God was saying, but still undertaking it, I think, perhaps without fully understanding what it maybe meant. But they did it alone. They didn't do it alone, did it as a team. And the last and final fifth thing, this principle of enterprising and being an entrepreneur, is that of not getting in God's way. Sometimes we need to stand back and allow God to act, maybe through us and through other people. It's not always about leading from the front. And this reminded me of Moses leading God's people out of Egypt and across the Red Sea. He'd had a tough time, he'd been hiding from God, hearing God's voice through the burning bush, petitioning with Pharaoh, who eventually let the people go after the plagues. And now we see them about to cross the Red Sea, the Egyptians chasing behind. And I just wanted to read from Exodus chapter 14, which gives this sense of Moses kind of almost getting out the way and allowing God's work to go forward. This is at the banks of the Red Sea. Then the angel of God, who'd been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other, so neither went near the other all night long. It's the Egyptians and the Israelites. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a well of water on their right and on their left. So Moses, in stretching his hand for all that time, was allowing everybody else to go in front of him and allowing God's power to work in order for this to happen. So he undertook to keep petitioning Pharaoh. He undertook leading the people out of Egypt, and he undertook actually not getting in the way, which was pretty important. But he did that by grasping the promise that God was giving to them of the promised land, by grasping God's voice, God's direction, his command, and God's ability to do this. So just to recap by showing you one last slide, here are those 5 thoughts again, which might be really helpful for you as you entrepreneur. And you might want to think about those biblical stories and accounts that I was linking to them. So to entrepreneur, I think from the Bible, we can see you need to have a thick skin to fend off opposition from Lydia. Have a vision that is so clear that you have to act out of love, which we saw through Nehemiah. Know your why, which we saw through Mary. Work as a team, which we saw through the Magi. And don't get in God's way, which we see through Moses at the Red Sea. So just to finish off, as you're embarking on new things or continuing with starting and growing new things, we've got to do it through the power of God, haven't we? And maybe some of those examples and principles from the Bible will really help you spiritually to do the internal work that then will help you to do the external work with people, place, in whatever you're doing.
Thank you, Ed. That's been such a great session. So many good points to come out of there. We haven't had any questions in the chat, but just a couple of questions for you. You were talking towards the end there about working as part of a team. and finding those who will work alongside you. And I know for particularly for people in business who are enterprising and are trying to launch something new, but also in church leadership when you're trying to develop something new, more often than not, it can feel like you're on your own doing it. What ways are there to connect with people who can walk alongside you, whether they're actually as part of your team in your church doing it or part of your business, but just who can be around you and kind of help you feel that you are part of something bigger?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a few things. I think you always want to have a mentor and a spiritual director who might be slightly outside of the context, who can help you to reflect and see what God's doing. I think it's pretty important. I think if you're pioneering or planting something, then I think it's always good to find the people of peace, to pray in those people of peace who might be in the church context in some way, and they may well be in the community. There's something about co-creating with the missional landscape, with those who you're trying to connect with in that place, who may not share your belief. They may not be necessarily Christians, but they have a similar passion to you. Maybe it's about social action or galvanizing the community in some way, whatever it is. That can be part of co-creating. So I actually think early adopters don't necessarily need to be on the same faith journey as you. I think if they are opposing to what you believe, that might be a slightly different thing. But if they're neutral to it, it can be a way of connecting. And in church, if you're in a church community already and you're wanting to start something new alongside it, I think again, finding the people of peace, but maybe it's trying to work out who the influencers are. Maybe it's working out who are the practical people, who are the supporters who maybe aren't going to get involved in it, but could catch the vision and give you some resources to do things. So I think that's helpful for a team, isn't it? Knowing your role. Actually, everyone's got a slightly different role to play. And if you can only find maybe two or three people who you kind of catch the vision in a different way, that's a start, isn't it? But it can be hard. I know what you mean. Yeah,
well, that's really good. We have had a question come in from Jerry Marshall, who's one of our speakers here at the conference. He's asked, and this depends how deep you want to get with this, is God an entrepreneur?
I think God must be an entrepreneur because, Jesus has talked about the pioneer, isn't he? And I think in the incarnation itself is something rather entrepreneurial. If we take those values of undertaking and grasping, well, we see it all there. But I just think a God that is a creator God has got to be an entrepreneur. Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so much more you could say, but yes, absolutely, yes.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Well, Ed, this has been really great. I can't see any more. Oh, hello. Here we go. I'm just looking at the chat now, and I can see another couple of questions coming up. Hannah has asked, can you still be considered an entrepreneur or entrepreneurial, even if you are an individual team, such as self-employed? I'll add myself to asking that question as well, because I'm in that same position as Hannah.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Yeah, no. And there are some situations where you need to do things alone, or you have to do things alone. Yeah, of course you are. I think in that way, somewhere, it's trying to find those people who can support you in what you're doing. If you're self-employed and you're doing your own thing, it's finding the supporters. May not be directly involved in what you're doing, but they can help you. Your family, your friends, spiritual director, mentor. No, of course.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, it makes me think back to last year when after the Stronger 2021 conference, this kind of question was on my mind, and I actually ended up connecting with a couple of other self-employed designers and photographers. One of them was my brother, another one was a friend who lives up there in Guildford, and we would have monthly Zoom sessions, just like half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, catching up on Zoom, just sharing our news, and then closing that with just praying for each other, and just speaking life over each other and speaking blessing over the pursuits that we were coming up with. Some of us we were going through periods where there just wasn't that much work coming in, so we were just praying for protection and for provision in those circumstances. And we found that connection, even though we were all on our own, doing our own thing, just having that connection, even just once a month, was such a strength and support. That was really good.
Yeah, and also just to add in there's something helpful about maybe trying to connect with people who are doing something similar but are further ahead. So
Yeah.
we've got a great friend who's set up her own jewelry business and making amazing jewelry. So that's an entrepreneurial thing to do. And she's connected with someone who's been doing it for a lot longer. And there's wisdom in being with people who are maybe slightly further along the entrepreneurial journey than you are at this stage that can give you wisdom.
That's really good. So Ed, you are now, and you've just started this position recently, Director of Innovation at St Mellitus. Tell us a little bit about that role.
Yeah, it's a great role. It's a brand new role. It's been created. I've been there since September. And really it's to help the National College, so St Mellitus is over 4 different centres around the country, to think about how we could innovate in the training of church leaders, in how we think theologically about things, and how we form ordained and lay people for leadership in the Church of England. And St Mellitus DNA has always been very innovative in the way it was birthed. It was, very different. Nothing had really been started like that before 15 years ago. So my job is to work with centre directors, and I'm part of the senior staff team, to help us to think about how we can respond to culture and context in the way that we train, but also in terms of the themes and the way that we might help people to form in their ministry, as well as some specific projects. One thing I'd love to do is think about how we worship and to help people to be really, really creative in how we create and curate worship as leaders. So yeah, all kinds of stuff like that, really.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really good. It's exciting. I work part-time for the Church of England in Portsmouth here, and so we get to hear about some of the national initiatives that are taking place, and hearing about the desire to raise up particularly lay leaders within the Church of England, to release them, and exciting because I'm part of that. I'm training to do that myself, but I did that because I saw this big initiative and I thought, that's something that resonates. I can be part of that. So it's exciting to hear all of these kind of pioneering things that are taking place within an organization that maybe outside people can look at it and think, oh, it's dying off, attendance is dropping, it's traditional and not relevant, but it's completely different, isn't it?
Yeah. And maybe one last thing to say as well. There's something about which we'd love to do to raise up the entrepreneurs, to raise up the innovators. So we'd really like to do some work to help people to think about how can they be more innovative, or how can they grow as an entrepreneur in all sorts of different ways. So it's also about the individual, isn't there, as well as the general.
That's really good. Ed, thank you so much for being part of Stronger 2022. It's been a pleasure having you.